On behalf of SLU Global and SLU Future Food, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar on how we can adapt food production to climate change. I'm Sara Gräslund and I'm the head of SLU Global. We're a unit in the Vice Chancellor's office that supports SLU's collaborations for global development to contribute to Agenda 2030. And SLU Future Food that we organize this together with is a transdisciplinary platform at the university for research and collaboration aimed specifically at sustainable food systems. And before we start, I want to inform all participants that this webinar is recorded. On the occasion of IPCC's sixth assessment reports that are presented in 2021 and 2022, we hold a series of scientific climate conversations at SLU. We organize this series together with SLU's 4 future platforms. And the previous seminar in the series was held a few months ago when the IPCC Physical Science Basis report was launched. In that discussion, Salim Hook from the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh stressed the point that many countries vulnerable to climate change are today high knowledge countries when it comes to climate adaptation, and that we have a lot to learn from them. In today's seminar, we relate to the IPCC report Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability that was released on February 28. We'll hear about the conclusions of the report from one of the co-chairs, and we'll discuss it with a particular focus on food production. We'll hear about some of the latest research, and we'll bring in this perspective of high knowledge countries and look at what we can learn when it comes to adapting food production from countries that already have worked intensively with climate adaptation over many years. And we are honored to have fantastic speakers with us today, and we look forward to a great discussion about how we can accelerate our efforts to tackle climate change.
Thank you very much, Sara, and a warm welcome to you all to today's webinar. My name is Paul Egan, and I'm an associate professor at SLU and a research advisor at SLU Global. So it's my pleasure to serve as moderator for today's talks and discussion on the theme of adapting food production to climate change. As mentioned by Sara, today's webinar is held as part of the ongoing Climate Conversation series at SLU. We're delighted to welcome well over 60 participants just now, including researchers, practitioners, journalists, and government officials from Sweden to the Philippines, Pakistan, the United States, South Africa, to name but a few. So a warm welcome to everybody joining from around the world. We at SLU focus on the very foundations of our existence: clean water, a living landscape, sustainable food production, high standards of animal welfare, and sustainable cities. Climate change cuts across all these domains. But today we focus on food, and we pose the question, how should we adapt food production under climate change? We'll take a look now at the agenda. And we've started with our welcome from Sara and myself. And pretty soon we'll jump into our 4 talks from our speakers. We will then move to the panel discussion and hear some thoughts from the speakers and a chance to have your questions answered. And then we'll wrap up with some concluding remarks. I'll give you some information about questions shortly. But first, I will introduce some of the speakers. So to help us tackle the question, how to adapt food production under climate change, we've lined up 4 excellent speakers. We're joined today by Dr. Debra Roberts, co-chair of Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Debra's unfortunately unable to present her talk as planned just now due to a power outage in South Africa, but she should still be able to join us for the panel discussion a little later on. So we look forward to hopefully welcoming Debra for the panel discussion. In place of her talk, Debra wished for us to air a recording from last week, from the official launch of the 6th assessment report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. It's also my pleasure to introduce Professor Jennie Barron from SLU, who will talk about limits of adaptation in food and water systems, with some African and South Asian case examples. We also welcome Dr. Stephen Wangi Mureithi from the University of Nairobi, Kenya, who will present on the current drought situation in East Africa, focusing on impacts and adaptation from a pastoralist perspective. We also welcome Associate Professor Harry Fisher from SLU, who will talk about local governance of climate adaptation, with particular case studies from South Asia. Together, these speakers cover a range of sectoral and disciplinary perspectives on adaptation, food production, and climate change. So just before we proceed with the talks, I wish to explain about the questions to the speakers. All questions will be taken in the panel discussion that follows after the talk session. Though while the talks are proceeding, we encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A function that can be found below in Zoom. We also encourage you to upvote good questions from your fellow attendees, and that can be done using the thumbs up indicator that you can find in the Q&A function. Without further ado, we can move on now to the talk section. And I will bring up a video that Dr. Debra Roberts wished us to air. But just to say a little bit about her background, she's currently head of the Sustainable and Resilient City Initiatives Unit in the municipality of Durban, South Africa. She was a lead author of the chapter on urban areas in Working Group 2's contribution to the IPCC 5th Assessment Report. And for the 6th assessment report, she served as co-chair of Working Group 2 report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. We'll share an outtake of the talk that Debra gave last week. She wished for us to see in her absence. And as I said, hopefully Debra will then join us for the panelist discussion. I will just share the video for you now.
You bring up the presentation, please. Firstly, thank you to everyone for joining us, and certainly as the co-chairs of Working Group 2, and on behalf of our authors, we are very proud to present this latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which focuses on climate change impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. 270 authors from 67 countries have worked tirelessly to produce this report. Over the last 5 years, they have assessed 34,000 scientific papers to prepare their findings. During the review process, they considered each one of 62,418 comments from experts and governments, which have helped make the report as comprehensive and clear as possible. We would like to thank everyone who has contributed to this process. Let us now share some of the key findings which reflect our growing scientific knowledge and provide the best understanding yet of climate change impacts, risks, options to adapt, and the limits we face. Perhaps this statement best summarizes our findings. The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. This report offers solutions to the world. And in the next 20 minutes, we will explore these with you. But let's start with the impacts.
We will now fast forward a little bit. So hold on.
Let's start from the beginning. Global warming of 1.1 degrees Celsius has caused dangerous and widespread disruption in nature. The increased frequency, intensity, and duration of extreme events on land and in the ocean is driving mass mortalities, for example, in trees, as we show here in this drought-stressed forest in California, USA. And climate change is affecting the lives and livelihoods of billions of people. The impacts from human-induced intensification of tropical cyclones, sea level rise, and heavy rainfall have resulted in increased losses and damages. Impacts are magnified in cities, where more than half the world's population lives. Heat waves amplify urban heat islands and air pollution to affect people's health. Critical infrastructure, such as transport, water, sanitation, and energy systems, have been compromised by extreme events.
When multiple extreme events happen at the same time, they compound the overall risk and are more difficult to manage. What we see here is an example of how heat and drought combine to cause reduction in crop yields, made worse by reduced productivity because of heat stress amongst farm workers. Reduced yields lead to reductions in household incomes, increased food prices, locally and potentially globally. Climate risks do not respect national boundaries, and weather-related extremes are creating shocks to global trade. In the previous slide, we illustrated the powerful impacts of climate change on nature and people's lives. In this assessment, it is based on a new understanding of these interconnections. We can no longer think in silos, but have to look across climate, biodiversity, and human society and well-being if we want to tackle the many global challenges we face today. And talking of other challenges, climate change combines with unsustainable use of natural resources, habitat destruction, deforestation, and growing urbanization, as well as inequity and marginalization. These trends not only present threats to ecosystems and the people who rely on them, but also reduce the capacities of nature, communities, and individuals to adapt to climate change. 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in global hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. These are across large parts of Africa, as well as South Asia, Central and South America, small islands, and the Arctic. In these global hotspots, overlapping challenges include limited access to water, sanitation, and health services. High levels of climate-sensitive livelihoods, such as smallholder farmers and fishing communities, all increase vulnerability. High levels of poverty, weak leadership, lack of funding, lack of accountability, and trust in government also play a part.
Looking to the future, every small increase in warming will result in increased risks to nature and to people in every region of the world. Here we see a bleached coral colony on a dying reef off Okinawa, Japan. Let's consider some of these projected impacts on nature. This map gives an overview of biodiversity loss at different warming levels. We would see species extinctions and losses of entire ecosystems, such as mountaintops, tropical coral reefs, and coastal wetlands, even if we temporarily exceed 1.5 degrees warming for several decades. The risk of extinction in biodiversity hotspots increases by about tenfold as warming rises from 1.5 to 3 degrees Celsius. Nature services support all aspects of our lives, from pollination and tourism to health and climate regulation. Loss of ecosystems and their services has cascading and long-term impacts on people globally, especially for indigenous peoples and local communities who directly depend on them. Globally, population exposure due to heat waves will continue to increase with additional warming. At approximately 2 degrees Celsius, regions that are highly dependent on snowmelt could experience a 20% decline in water availability for agriculture beyond 2050. And we know that climate change will undermine food security. At 2 degrees warming, by 2050, people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Central and South America, and on small islands are likely to experience food shortages, leading to malnutrition. About 1 billion people living in low-lying cities and other settlements on the coast are projected to be at risk from sea level rise and other climate hazards by mid-century. We provide a global perspective here, but this report also has an extensive regional focus. We have outlined the challenges we face and how they will increase at higher warming levels. The key question now is, how well are we adapting to changing climate? What we show is that action has increased, but progress is uneven, and we are not adapting fast enough. Growing public and political awareness of climate impacts and risks has resulted in at least 170 countries and many cities, including adaptation in their climate policies and planning. However, there are increasing gaps between adaptation action taken and what's needed. These gaps are largest among lower income populations. At the current rate of planning and implementation, these adaptation gaps will continue to grow.
Let's now turn our attention to how we adapt. And in this report, we show that there are feasible, effective options we can take to reduce the risk to people and nature, but their effectiveness decreases with increasing warming. When we think of adaptation, our first thoughts must be around reducing flood risk or preventing water shortages. But what we show is that the strengthening of health systems can reduce the impacts of infectious diseases, heat stress, and other climate-related risks, as well as the trauma associated with extreme events. This is particularly effective if it's combined with other measures, such as disease surveillance, early warning systems, and improving access to potable water. Nature offers significant untapped potential, not only to reduce climate risks and deal with the causes of climate change, but also to improve people's lives and livelihoods. Agroforestry is a climate-resilient way of growing food and creating wildlife habitat. Here we see a Nigerian rubber farmer diversifying his business with food crops, fruit trees, and bees. Conservation, protection, and restoration can help natural forests to adapt. Planting a range of tree species, managing pests and diseases, and reducing wildfire risks can help build climate resilience in managed forests. In agriculture, irrigation can be effective, but it can also result in adverse outcomes, such as accelerated depletion of groundwater. This and other adaptation measures provide economic and ecological benefits, as well as reducing vulnerability. In urban areas and elsewhere, effective urban management can secure drinking water. Most action to date has occurred around water-related hazards, such as reducing the risks from floods and droughts. Letting nature take its course, such as restoring wetlands and rivers and creating no-build zones, can reduce flood risks. The effectiveness of most water-related adaptation declines with increasing warming.
Yes, we could jump out at that part from Debra's talk. But if you do want to prepare some questions in the meantime for when She will hopefully join us in the panel discussion. You're welcome to do that in the Q&A section. So we can move on to the next speaker, Professor Jennie Barron from the Department of Soil and Environment at SLU. Jennie, you are sharing your presentation as I speak, which is great. Thank you. I'll just give a bit of background about you. So Jennie's expertise is within agricultural water management, and her research and outreach program aims to deliver evidence-based knowledge for policy and investments in food security, productivity, and resilience under climatic and social change. And this is both in Sweden and in regions of sub-Sahara Africa and Asia. And Jennie's talk is talking about the limits of adaptation, which we have heard from the IPCC report is something that is a critical issue and needs due acknowledgement. With that, I will hand over to you, Jennie. So very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paul. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, we're good. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me here today. This is really an urgent issue that I hope that we will keep much more into our daily conversations going forward. So I was invited here to talk a little bit about the limits of adaptation, which is somewhat much stronger coming through the Working Group 2 report that was released two weeks ago, I think it was. And I want to add this issue about dealing with unknowns. So although this report is summarizing the science, is the last report in 2013, there is still a lot of unknown, and their interrelations and the complexity of the systems are increasing with climate change. So next, please. So I'll just say a few words on this, reaching the limits of adaptation, and then I'll bring two examples to illustrate how this can play out in a bottom-up kind of research for a development context that I've been working on. And I'll finish off with a few points on new knowledge, innovation, and finance. Next, please. So we had a lot of recent reports, and of course the IPCC, the most prominent coming now. But this is something that is a conversation that has been going on for several years now. And of course, it should be linked to development. Climate change is not separate from development. And in my work, we refer to, for example, the UN Food Summit that took place last year, the Food and Agriculture Organization that has revamped their interest in water management for agriculture, and of course, the upcoming Water Summit that will happen in 2023. Next, please. So I did read the technical summary, which is still in its draft form, and it is a very shocking document, and I do recommend all of you to have a look at it. And there is high confidence that we're on the wrong track and things are not going in the right way and they are getting worse. And in my particular field of work with agriculture, water management, trying to build resilience into our crop production system through water management, this is really challenging because we're the toolbox that we can use to adapt is getting more and more limiting. We're already having tools in use, and this is the challenge. What do we do when the tools, we're running out of tools? I would particularly say also that climate change is an added stress, not as we heard in the statement in the film, that we are already having maybe in some places degraded system, but on the other hand, in many places agriculture systems, we have fantastic work being done. So it's not like we haven't done nothing, but we have systems which are already well underway to consider adaptation to current and to future climate. And that's also adding to the limitations of the toolbox. Next, please. So I wanted to bring two examples from a more bottom-up perspective, and these examples today are from the farming systems one in sub-Saharan Africa and one in India. And here is an example of how change is already underway. And these are from an afforestation project that we're carrying out for research in Ethiopia, showing the change of landscape by farmers' own market-driven afforestation going from 2000 to 2020. And you can see that the change is already happening. And this is yet another example that we're perhaps running out of tools to actually make a change. Next, please. So first of all, we have had a remarkable development of production and intensification, and yet we have still the same number of undernourished people struggling to access food as we had in 1990, even if the percentages are on the track. But the more important thing for me is maybe that we have about 500 million smallholder farmers, and they support 50 to 77% of food supply and the nutrition supply, and maybe more than that in many regions of the world. And if we have, like on these graphs, you see different geographical regions. We have the yield increase from 1960 to 2015, 18. And then on the y-axis, we see the area. So we can see that for some regions like South Asia and North and West Europe, we have the same type of trends, that yields have increased on almost the same area, which then clearly has very strong sustainability, so intensification measure. Whereas in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Australia and New Zealand, there's slightly different trends where you both have a yield increase as well as an area increase over this period of time. Of course, it's led to a lot of problems, but this is an essential thing when we need to consider that we're getting more people in the world, and we need to supply these people with more food, more nutrition when yields are decreasing. And I was looking for the numbers in the recent report, and I think somewhere I saw at least 10% is attributed to the global decrease of food due to climate change alone in small scenarios, and of course more in specific regions and locations. Next, please. So one of our research projects a couple of years back, that was to can we reach, can communities, local communities build their own resilience to the climate variability and enhance degraded landscapes that we see in some rural context around the world. And we had the intent of the project was to build resilience to water and food insecurity among smallholder farmers, farmer-dominated rain-fed landscapes in Ghana and Ethiopia. And they had already experienced weather-related disturbances of both droughts and floods, winds, etc., that put the system into serious stress every 3 to 5 years in these locations. And in addition, there were other challenges. Of course, they had disease outbreaks or market issues that set the production back. Our findings were, when we facilitated these development plans in the catchment, that there is a high community willingness. People were very engaged. They were really proactive in suggesting measures and pathways or actions to build resilience, to increase the productivity and the health of the landscape. But the watershed adaptation action plans were extremely limited in terms of innovations, limited in addressing these extreme events, and limited in realization of the internal capacity. So that the knowledge, internal knowledge, or the internal, for example, finance or labor capital in the communities were probably not going to be sufficient to meet the current weather variability. And of course, if this is increasing, it will be further challenge. So next example, please. The second example is very similar. The ambition was to build resilience to climate variability, improve productivity in agriculture-dominated landscapes. And this was in India, where in 2000, about 20 years ago, the farmers felt an increasing aridity. Traditional rainwater management did not manage to bridge this new climate reality that they were facing. Also the actual structures were not engineered to manage new high rainfall events or collect the amount of runoff that was faced in the landscape. So a project was initiated with researchers together with extension and farmers in a co-design. And this resulted in a package of actions to improve the farming systems. So it was not just the rainwater harvesting structures, which were specifically designed to meet these new weather events that the region was facing, and therefore much more successful to withstand the challenges of weather. But it was also combined with a range of other crop production, soil management interventions to make it like a package of multiple actions for the farmers. And this was so successful, so farmers actually have, policymakers have upscaled this to, I think it's about 20,000 farmers, which then is scaled in the catchment programs. And my point here is that here there was a new feature unknown to the local farmers, that they couldn't design or adapt to the new weather circumstances. The technology did not fit or operate well in the new climate they were facing. And with the help of new knowledge, in this case from researchers and other practitioners, they could redesign or adapt their current farming systems. Next, please. So uncertainty requires new knowledge and innovation and finance, and it's embedded in the development for climate resilience. So this is important, that you cannot solve unknown challenges with existing knowledge alone. Next, please. So of course, I'm a researcher, and it's good that I keep my job, but for the future, I think that we have to be much more open to this co-design and having evidence-based input into complex systems solutions. And with the limits of climate change adaptation, this transformation need to be, it will be more challenging, and it will be more expensive to find solutions working in a specific agroecological system or agroecological landscape. And some critical components are well known, and some are already implemented. The toolbox is shrinking, and some are unknown. And this is where we need to have that investment into research and innovation alongside. And there are some calculations, especially for the developing country context, that supports climate adaptation, water security, and development would be about $15.2 billion US dollars a year. So this is about 10% of what the technical working group cost of adaptation that need to be specifically invested into research and innovation for supporting climate adaptation in going forward. So I would like to stop there. Thank you very much, Paul. And looking forward to the panel conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jennie, for a really enlightening talk on the limits to adaptation, which again is such a critical topic to acknowledge. And I would like to encourage questions more to keep coming in the Q&A to Jennie and all the other speakers, and also to use the upvote function. If you see questions that you think are good and you really want to see asked, use the upvote function and give a thumbs up so that we can pick them up. And I would like to say a welcome to Debra Roberts, who has managed to join us just now after the power has come back online in Durban. Debra, are you there? Could you say hello? Test your microphone.
Hi, Paul. Yes, I'm here. The power's back on. I have no idea how long for, but happy to be here. I think this is a real indication of how development needs overlap with climate change needs. If you don't have basic services responding or advancing climate change, is quite limiting.
Great. And you've already done the hard work last week for us. We showed your talk from the press release. So yeah, we've been informed of your talk from then, but we look forward to touching base with you in the panelist discussion, which follows the talks.
Fabulous.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.
We'll move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Stephen Wangi Mureithi, and he is a senior lecturer from the Department of Land Resource Management and Agricultural Technology at the University of Nairobi. And Stephen is a leading Kenyan scientist in rangeland ecology and management, and has extensive knowledge of pastoralist systems in East African rangelands. And we're really lucky to have Stephen here with us today to present a current state snapshot of the ongoing drought situation in East Africa, and in particular on impacts and adaptation from a pastoralist perspective. Stephen, I welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for the participants and my fellow panelists. I would like to present to you on the impacts and adaptation of current droughts in East Africa. And I'll give you the perspective from the pastoralist and agro-pastoralist whom I've been working with for the years I've been practicing as a researcher in the rangelands. Next slide. So I mentioned that arid and semi-arid areas, which we call in short ASAL, in East Africa are endowed ecosystems with which are rich and fragile. And I know that vast areas of these lands are currently severely degraded. For instance, if you see satellite photos from, for example, northern Kenya, parts of Ethiopia, it's completely bare ground, and especially during the dry season, meaning that much of the herbaceous cover, which livestock use as feed, forage, has been degraded. And pastoralism and agro-pastoralism are the main sources of livelihoods for the communities in East Africa, arid and semi-arid lands. That is, their livelihoods are livestock-based, and there are also other livelihood sources, for example, the artisanal fishing, urban and peri-urban formal and informal employments, casual wage labor and business category in these areas. But the main are livestock keeping. And rainfall variability is the main climate and weather element affecting ecosystem services, agricultural production and socioeconomic development in these regions, as the evidence have shown. And this is exacerbated by frequent drought and floods that sometimes come back to back. Sometimes we have severe drought and then eventually it's followed by a flood. And pastoralist and agro-pastoralist in the ASAL in the past used to cope well, and many of them have told us when drought came, they were well prepared, and it was part of their lives. They could know, even the elders can be able to tell in 1 year time or in the next season we are going to have drought, so they can maybe migrate. And pastoralist strategy for these harsh environments includes a species mix, that is having variety of livestock classes, for example, cattle, sheep, goat, camel, and also resource reserves. They could plan their resource reserves, and also mobility. Migration to where resources are available is a very key adaptation, coping and adaptation mechanism. Next slide. But we note climate change, climate variability, social and economic and environmental changes have taken place in the last few decades, have disrupted these traditional mechanisms. So the people are hard pressed because the mechanisms they used to rely on have been disrupted. And for instance, the cycle of drought have become shorter in between. For example, every 2 to 3 years, as opposed compared to previously maybe 10 to 5 years. And droughts now have a more devastating effect. Water sources dry up and land becomes parched, large numbers of livestock, and people go thirsty and hungry. And mostly during protracted dry season and drought, animals die because there is no pasture. The pastures are very scarce, and at some worst times, also people lose their lives. And dealing with the humanitarian catastrophe is enormously expensive and rarely successful if the approach is to deal with emergencies as opposed to preparing during the normal times. Next slide. And drought is devastating. The pastoralists have lost much of their livelihood base due to droughts and also floods. And for instance, the drought of 2009 to 2012, the pastoralists lost almost 75% of their livestock. The recent drought that has been going on, for example, in northern Kenya, parts of Somalia, and southern Ethiopia, even camel, animals like camel that are handy, well adapted to harsh conditions, have been lost, including wildlife and giraffes. And vulnerability to food insecurity is increasing with the time, evident by the increasing number of undernourished people in the ASAL. I echo the words of Jennie Barron, who have said that even if much have been done, still things have remained the same. So there has to be something that we will have to do different. And land degradation, pasture scarcity, and lack of water increases this vulnerability. And resource conflicts are common during dry season and drought, and insecurity, livestock raids, contributing to vegetation changes through restriction of movements of animals, livestock in some places, resulting to overgrazing in more secure areas, because people will concentrate their animals in more secure areas. And those are some of the photos that we see in the television or on the ground every 2 to 3 years now. For example, just recently in the northern Kenya region. Next slide. But there is hope in all this. So, for example, the inter-community grazing reciprocal agreements have been used to promote peace, creating safer access to dry season water and pasture. And here I give the example of the ongoing reciprocal agreements between the Turkana in northwestern Kenya and the Karamojong community in northeastern Uganda, such that when there is drought, the Turkana community can drive their cattle to Uganda to access pasture and water. And conflict resolution and reconciliation linked to resource use planning is likely to be long-lasting. And with proper drought cycle management and resource use planning and management, famine need not to occur in the ASAL every drought period, which is the case presently. Every time we have drought, then we have famine. And many households are changing herds from grazers, cattle and sheep, to more browsers, adopting more goat and camel as an adaptation strategy, and also diversifying their sources of livelihoods. Some of them have actually dropped out of pastoralism. They were not able to restock, and they are turning to all sorts of activities like charcoal burning, which has an adverse effect to the ecosystem, others to irrigation and beekeeping and such other activities. And there I give you some photos of some restoration work that have been done, but the scale is limited. Next slide. So much is being done. I have to appreciate that by the East African national and local governments, non-governmental organizations, and also private players, which are trying to introduce a range of preemptive measures. For instance, the governments are trying to build transport infrastructure to integrate markets, but there is still more that needs to be done to safeguard household food and nutrition security. And some of them include promoting asset buffers at household level to reduce their vulnerability, promoting land restoration. And with the land restoration, we know we tackle the issue of land productivity, the climate through carbon sequestration, and also the livelihoods. And access to credit, very important for the ASAL communities, and also insurance mechanisms, both micro risk transfer and also macro. For example, like the African risk capacity mechanisms. We have CRIP livestock insurance in Kenya that have been adopted in a few counties. Against the impact of weather-related shocks, we need to strengthen markets to minimize supply failures and thus reduce the chronic poverty, and scaling adaptation during the normal times. This is very important, that normal times, we have to work to know that drought is natural and it will occur, but then we don't have to have an emergency when it occurs. And then I'm calling here for planning and management to catch up. Next slide. I think those are that I add there. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Stephen, for an excellent presentation and insight into an ongoing climate-related shock in East Africa. So it's really great to have some real-time perspectives on these situations and your reaction to them and viewpoints from a pastoralist perspective. Again, questions are welcome to Stephen in the Q&A function, and we will pick those up in the panelist discussion. So next, I would like to introduce Associate Professor Harry Fisher. Harry's from the Department of Urban and Rural Development at SLU, and his research explores the intersection between environmental governance, rural development, and democratic politics in the developing world, with a particular focus on India and Nepal. So today, Harry will discuss his ongoing work on social vulnerability and climate adaptation governance in the Himalayas. Very welcome to you, Harry, and over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for everyone that organized this. This is a real pleasure to be a part of this discussion. Yeah, so I'm an associate professor at the Department of Urban and Rural Development here at SLU. And I think at the broadest level, I study governance. And my central claim is simply that governance, and in particular local governance, is essential for more effective, just, and sustainable climate adaptation. And I was struck by the video we watched earlier. There was a discussion about, or comment about how there is a gap between actions taken and actions needed in climate adaptation. And I want to point out one additional gap, which was actually quite close to what Jennie presented in her research, which is that there is often a gap between the technical solutions that we envision and local lived realities that are needed to actually address people's actual concerns. Next slide, please. So governance is something that we all talk about. It figures prominently in the 6th assessment report. And governance is, at the broadest level, we could say, the mixture of norms, institutions, processes, and rules by which we solve collective problems. And what I want to point out here is that much of science focuses on how to build knowledge to design better kinds of interventions. But governance entails a shift of thinking, because basically governance is sort of a soft infrastructure of human institutions and interactions that enable people to come together to solve problems and to make sure that the interventions that we're implementing actually reflect local needs and actually work in practice. So my argument can be summed up in 2 propositions. Next slide. The first proposition is that better expert planning will not solve the challenges of climate adaptation alone. So we often think that grand challenges require grand solutions. And grand solutions are what experts, planners, and policymakers often focus their attention on. But climate change throws this out the window. And that's because there is no climate model precise enough to tell us what the climate is going to look like in specific localities, much less how particular kinds of events are going to cascade through complex livelihood systems. And what this means is that planners may often be unable to plan. And I appreciate Jennie also pointed this out in her own way. So when we dream up technical solutions, we face a problem. What kinds of institutions are better able to connect these interventions to diverse and highly uncertain local contexts? Next slide, please. The second proposition is that better local governance is needed and essential for effective climate adaptation. So there's this idea of community-based adaptation, and basically it is founded on the idea of giving support to communities to direct their own adaptation decision-making. And we have reason to believe that local actors have a comparative advantage for coordinating many different kinds of adaptation actions. They have knowledge of local needs, they're aware of context-specific conditions and local changes, and they have an ability to integrate external support with existing livelihood systems. And so the million-dollar question here for adaptation research is, how can this actually be achieved? Next slide. So I've been working in northern India in the Himalayan region for some time. This is an area that has seen very substantial and long-term impacts of climate change. Next slide. And in the first case I present, we see declining rainfall over a period of many years and increasing dry summer months and growing water scarcity during that time. Next slide. So I did a survey of community-led development interventions. These are projects that are designed and led by communities with the support of the government. And in the survey, nearly 80% of water projects were reported to be increasing water availability during times of distress. And that's quite high for a success rate for these kinds of projects. Next slide. And the reason for this success is that projects were planned by communities. They were well integrated within the landscape. They were responsive to local needs and priorities. They provided the opportunity for experimentation, evaluation, changing strategies if these interventions did not work. And there was also a sense of local ownership. As one of my respondents told me, quote, "This is our canal, this is our work." So there was this sense that they really wanted to make sure that this worked well. Next slide. And when I analyzed the data, I found that across the sample, benefits were skewing towards poorer and more marginal groups, and that stronger local participation was associated with better climate support. So community-based planning was both effective and inclusive, and benefits improved the more participatory that planning was. But there were other factors that made this work, and that signals the importance of long-term support for institutions, democratic institutions, and processes. Next slide. So the second case I present looks at a context that once specialized in apple production, but warming temperatures led to a significant decline in apples in the 1990s, and this led to significant economic distress. Next slide. But what happened, and what I think would not have been predicted at the time, was that apples were gradually replaced with a wide diversity of other crops. Next slide. And so we did some network analysis, and we saw that there were a wide range of supportive institutions that helped to support this change. Extension services with the Agriculture and Horticulture Department, banks for access to credit, and a research station associated with the State Agricultural University. So there was continual support for diverse kinds of agricultural information and knowledge, catering to different kinds of local needs. Next slide. So we asked each farmer in the village what households they interact with in the village to get agricultural information. And we used this to create a social network. And we were able to trace an ongoing process of experimentation, innovation, and diffusion of new crops and agricultural strategies. So there is a diversity of state institutions here that enable farmers to try different things, see what works, and over time, the entire agricultural system has adapted to new conditions. Next slide. So I can offer a few take-home points. The first is that, as I said, better expert planning will not solve the challenges of climate adaptation alone. So good science and technical strategies, the sorts of things that we really excel here at SLU, are not enough. But local governance is essential to ensure that available support reaches those in need. And as I see it, this is one of the most important priorities that we face at present, which is investing in building effective local governance structures over the long term, and making sure that communities have the resources, the discretion, and control in defining their own agendas. And when we do this, we need to recognize that there is no single solution. There needs to be a broader ecosystem of support from diverse institutions to address different kinds of local needs. And to make this all work, there needs to be long-term investments in democratic capacities and inclusion. Next slide. And as a final thought, I offer this quote from sociologist Erik Olin Wright, which is, quote, "It would be undesirable to find definitive institutional answers to various problems. Our real task is to try to think of institutions which themselves are capable of dynamic change, of responding to the needs of the people and evolving accordingly, rather than institutions that are so perfect that they need no further change." And with that, thank you very much. Next slide. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Harry. Fascinating talk. And we really should think from the knowledge you've shared to us, what could and should local governance be? So that's very relevant thoughts for us to take with us. We're all subject to local governance, and we perhaps ought to think of it like that. Yeah, so I wish to thank all of our speakers for their talks, and we can move now into the panelist discussion part of the agenda in today's seminar. So thanks again to all the speakers for sharing their great insights into their respective topics. And we'll open the general discussion, open the floor to all four of the speakers just now, just to share your thoughts collectively on what you've heard each other speaking about. So we'll have just some open space for some dialogue amongst the panelists here, and then we will take some questions that have been coming in from the attendees in the questions and answers function. We'll just note that adapting food production to climate change, the topic of today's webinar will require multi-sectoral and multi-actor approaches, and we've seen good questions coming in from that from the attendees. So I'd like to invite the panelists now to share their brief reflection on what they've heard today from each other. So we'll open the floor. I think we could start perhaps with Debra.
Given that I came in halfway through, maybe these will be sort of 50% reflections. But in all seriousness, and just looking at some of the questions that are being asked in the Q&A, and I think Harry and Stephen made this point really clearly, that a simple normative technical approach is not going to work, and that really is the key message of our report in terms of adaptation. We acknowledge adaptation is happening, and it has certainly improved situations for human and natural communities alike, but it's simply uneven. It's not happening fast enough. It's not happening at scale. And the new points we raise about adaptation are the dangers of maladaptation. And so, for example, Harry was talking about irrigation, Stephen was talking about charcoal burning. So these are all adaptation measures which I could see could have really unintended consequences in terms of water source depletion, destruction of habitat. And we're also acknowledging very real adaptation limits within the systems that we're working in, particularly as global warming levels rise. So I would imagine in Stephen's case, while there might be a coming together of communities, if we reach 2 or 3 degrees, remember sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Africa heating twice as fast as the rest of the world, not even communities coming together will allow adaptation to happen. So I think we carry a really tough message to the world. That's why the Secretary General was as articulate as he was about our impact on the planet. We're clobbering ourselves and the planet. And we need to have a new approach. And unfortunately, the message is we need to do everything now all together, which is a tough place to be when we work in a society which is very imbalanced, inequitable, and doesn't respect the rights necessarily of all communities, particularly the poor and disadvantaged, and certainly doesn't have an effective compact with the planet it lives on. So I think we're at a tipping point. The question is how we move forward from that. Thanks very much, Paul.
Thanks, Debra. And any of the other panelists, you can jump in with some thoughts or reflections from what you've heard from each other. Jennie, I could ask, maybe you'd like to share some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. I think one thing that comes through in the talks as well today, which is of course a very small selected sample of all the work that is going on by academics around the world, is that many of the messages of the urgency in the working group to report is high confidence. So there is no doubt that we're in a very dire situation, and I look at the water and the food systems messages particularly, and what we can do, and maybe what we can do, and as Debra said, yes, we need to do all at once, even much more in an integrated manner now. So it's not about doing technical solutions alone, but we need to have that social, institutional part into it. We need to have that traditional knowledge into it, and we need to work together across researcher to farmer, practitioner, landowner. So it's a super complex and sometimes very demanding and consuming way of working and processes that we need to take part in. But I think that we also need to be, at least as a researcher, we need to be very pay attention also to what the working group reports are not talking about, and what are the things that they are low in confidence or disagreement evidence, that these are the things that we as researcher needs to really engage with forward. And I think that there are some evidence talking about like the processes, what needs to come together. But I do think that that part of the evidence, what really levers a change, what makes a transformation happen in the positive or perhaps a negative way, where are we reaching the absolute limits of livelihoods or well-being, sustainability. And this is where we need to have the new research for the coming summarizing reports. And this is where we researchers need to reflect really carefully. Okay, if this is where we have lots of evidence, it's going in an agreement, we don't need to pay more attention to that right now. We might need to look into those unexplored fields that the reports are not talking so much about. Thanks.
Very interesting thoughts, Jennie. Thanks for sharing that with us. I'll invite Stephen then as well to share some reflections on what you've heard from all of us today.
Thank you very much, Paul. I have the point of Debra from her video presentation of adaptation action points that are being taken, and the gap between what is needed also stood out for me. And I can give a live example. For example, many governments that are investing a lot of money to revitalize, to upgrade the livestock sale yards, for example, in East Africa, and also abattoirs for slaughtering the livestock. But when you look on the ground, after every 2-3 years, the same livestock is dead because there is no fodder. And we have been championing. As a researcher, I've been working on land degradation, land restoration, particularly targeting fodder production. And I see on the ground that is what is needed. So I would rather the money going to do something else comes to promote fodder production. And we deal with sale yards and abattoirs a little later when we have fodder on the ground. And also the point of involving the local communities. What is the local reality on scaling adaptation is very, very key. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And I'll invite you to share your general reflections, but I think I'll also throw a first question out to you, if you don't mind, from the question and answer. We have one about the barriers to creating the kind of local governance structure that you presented about. How might they be overcome?
Well, if I had an answer to that, maybe I'd have a Nobel Prize or something. I don't know. But in any case, no, I think it's a really great question. And it also connects a little bit to some of the thoughts I was thinking about with regard to some of the other presentations as well. So I think one concern that I often have in my work is a lot of my research has occurred in places where governance is relatively good and outcomes are fairly successful, comparatively speaking, right? And we know that that's actually not real in vast parts of the world, right? And so when Debra talks about how progress is very uneven and we continue to have great vulnerability in many parts of the world, I'm extremely sympathetic to that. And that actually, in a way, needs to be foregrounded first and foremost. Now, I think that one thing that I appreciate all of these talks sort of hit upon was the social dimensions of environment and climate change, right? So we know that vulnerability is not merely a function of exposure to adverse conditions and adverse climate events, right? It's sort of a part of our social systems as well, right? That influence what options people have and their ability to respond and to cope. So one concern that I have, so Debra sort of highlights the importance and urgency of the issue of climate change at this moment. We need to act. But then there's also this risk that if we act urgently without reflecting, will result in maladaptation as well. Right. And that's my sort of central concern. And so I think there's sort of a challenge here. And I was reflecting a little bit with Jennie's presentation. You know, we have a case that is fairly successful and a case that shows clear limits. Right. And so I was thinking, what really is the difference between different contexts that allows the state and governance and institutions to work such that they are able to actually respond to those needs? It was essentially the question that was just posed at me. And I would say that we need to focus on long-term building of institutions in democratic ways. And this is not just a part of establishing local institutions, but on ensuring that there's a bigger sort of democratic state that is responsive to needs, where there are mechanisms of public accountability in place. But I also recognize that one of the critical things here is that facing urgency to respond to climate change is one thing, and long-term sort of multi-decadal support of institutions and processes is another, right? And I think that's one of the fundamental challenges we're facing.
Thanks very much, Harry. Very insightful thoughts there, and good that you've raised your gladness about the social factors being raised in these types of dialogues. I'll throw a question to you, Debra, and there's two in the chat that are quite similar, so I will piece them together perhaps into one, but one is also about this issue with the governments. What do you think, or maybe what is the report saying about why aren't proactive steps perhaps being seen a bit more, especially if these are economically paying for themselves in some way in presenting disasters and shocks down the line?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges, and it's a message that's emerging in many of the conversations I've been having over the last 2 weeks linked to the report, is that, you know, our sense of agency and the outcomes of that agency are very often linked to power and politics and vested interests in maintaining the status quo. And I think this is a challenge. Certainly from an adaptation point of view, our assessment of adaptation finance is that it's grossly underrepresented when we compare it to the need that is out there. We also know that the bulk of adaptation flows are into mitigation. There's a real reason for that, is in mitigation, you can get the private sector investing substantially, and there can be you know, a reward for that investment, and it's quite immediate, and the known responses to mitigation are quite clear and structured, whereas all the conversations, at least the parts I was privy to today, indicate the contextuality of adaptation. You've got to know the place people are living, who those people are, how they're interacting, and so adaptation, in terms of our assessment, clearly indicates that the bulk of the investment is currently from the private or the public purse, simply because there isn't that immediate benefit to the private sector. And I think that's one of the major issues with adaptation, is because you have to think about people, where they live, their value systems, what works in their areas. You can't roll out one size fits all solutions, and I think that's problematic. It also draws in the difficult politics. You know, who has power in a society? We've been saying in the IPCC since the special report of 1.5 that without political and social will, nothing is going to move. And very often the poor and disadvantaged, those who sit on the outskirts, so indigenous groups, ethnic minorities, people in informal settlements, don't have clear conduits to those power bases. And I think that's what Harry was saying. You know, you need good governance, not only in your local community, for example, as Stephen was talking about, but that needs to be able to have some influence in a city hall somewhere, in a parliament somewhere. And those power links are either non-existent or broken. And so I think it's these complex factors of who has power, who holds resources, who has influence over those power and resources, means that adaptation is not a priority for a whole host of reasons. So it does require us to do a rethink about our society and how it's structured, which is why we call out very strongly this need for transformation, system transitions, climate resilient development, those big picture drives for a new social movement, a new social compact with the way we live our lives and are on the planet. So we've moved past a shopping list of technical solutions, restore a wetland here, put a pipe in over there, plant a street tree over here. That simply doesn't do the job anymore. We're talking about a fundamental restructuring of society, and that's a big order.
Thank you so much, Debra, for that response. And perhaps touching on that issue, we have a question here, and Jennie, perhaps you could take this one. It is related to technologies. In your talk, you talked about the toolbox is shrinking, but how much, with this in mind, what we've heard from Debra, what role do you see technologies playing? Is there any promising efforts that you still see in that area to work with adaptation and not just overly focused on mitigation?
I hope Debra could help me as well. I mean, I don't know the full report by heart yet, but actually, I think that the evidence on the role of technology to help adaptation is not so strong. If we talk about like that, those complex processes that technology together with social innovation or economic innovations are actually shifting and adapting a local landscape, local social community, whatever. That type of evidence is just not there. Maybe it's too complex to analyze. I do think we do have evidence, but I also think that to get that technology, and I was trying to say that in my first example, that without that external input, whether finance, whether ideas, whether knowledge, the internal capacity could not deal with the challenges at hand by themselves. And this is where I think that we cannot rely on our existing knowledge, and we got to keep develop both at the farm field level or local landscape, as well as in our academic institutions. That new knowledge is going to be so essential to meet the unknown that we're facing. And in terms of technology, yes, we do know that a lot of technologies can do a difference. But for example, we know also that some technologies, such as the mobile phones, has fundamentally changed people's lives, and the haves and have-nots of digital services or ITC is making a huge difference to people's livelihood. But again, I don't see that type of evidence perhaps in the IPCC yet, and maybe we can see those enablers come through, and some of that evidence come through. What role does technology play vis-a-vis other incentives like access to good structure or democratic processes? So yeah, I hope to see that next round a little bit stronger with the specific pathways. They're very generic in the current example. Well, my personal perspective. Debra, please help me here.
Thumbs up from Debra. Thank you, Jennie, for that. And finance and adaptation finance is one of the key messages that at least I've seen coming through in the report and listening to Debra. And I have a question here to Stephen on that aspect. We saw you mentioning some details about financing and insurance mechanisms. And the question here is asking, how can, in particular, researchers access the right funding to undertake detailed studies to influence policy in this area? So it's more about researchers, actually, this question.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think, yeah, generally, the way it is now, for example, the grant, the organizations or governments that issues grants, they are maybe particularly targeting a particular sector, or for example, if it is for climate, if you see like the IDRC or CEDA, they will target and say, okay, you can work on these watershed issues or biodiversity or such. So as researchers, then it's a bit limited. There is a limitation there because there is no open grant that is, a pool that maybe you would like to direct it to a certain specific area, but we have to fulfill the conditions of the grant. Yet it's still an opportunity, because even through those grants, we can tailor the proposals to a specific area, which we know that there are gaps in information, there are gaps in knowledge, there are gaps in evidence that can eventually influence policy. One, at local level, very important, and also at national, regional, and also global. Because if you look at this working group 2 report, it's an amalgamation of all the evidence from all those studies that you have shown in that presentation of Debra. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Yes, many of our audience today are indeed researchers, so we are thinking how we can actively pursue these kind of changes ourselves, and of course, financing in that domain is also very important. Harry, I would like to ask you, bringing again these social considerations into adaptation. We have one question here that is asking about the gender equality dimension, and Debra has also talked about marginalized groups, but do you see gender equality being integrated into approaches from a governance perspective?
This, again, is one of the limitations, one of the big limitations with local governance in many contexts. We've talked about being gender inclusive for many years, and often that's still not achieved. And there's various kinds of barriers for that. I would say that in my context, where I do research, there is at least some improvement to that. And one of the improvements to that is that the Indian Constitution, or an amendment to the Indian Constitution, established a system of reservations which reserve elected seats for women. At least 1/3 of all elected seats in local elected governments have to go to women, and it's on a rotational basis. So that's one institutional innovation that I can point toward that is highly imperfect and highly diversely implemented in different parts of the country, but which nonetheless has helped to lead towards greater inclusion. But I think that what that tells me is that when we think about local governance, we very explicitly need to recognize this issue and to take steps to address it and not sort of leave it to the side.
Thank you for that, Harry. And Debra, maybe I'll just extend the same question to you in relation to the 6th assessment report. What kind of messages are we seeing about gender in particular, gender equality?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it goes to some points I've already indicated. I think the strongest message we have is we need a whole of society approach. And given that 50% of our society, for example, is made up of women, gender is obviously an important consideration. But we clearly identify that gender is a point of great vulnerability, and as a result, the adaptive capacity of certain sectors of society are low. this goes back to the point that I think Harry and I have been reinforcing, is that you've got to think about the governance of society, who plays a role. You know, particularly if we're looking at some of the adaptation responses in continents like Africa, as Stephen's already indicated, you know, many of these are land-based. Who controls the land? Who works the land? Who has access to the land? Become really important barriers. And again, it speaks to this, you know, it would be so easy if Working Group 2 could sort of come up and say, look, here are 20 things you can do, and then the world be fully adapted. Our analysis indicates, and you know, Jenny's pointing to that, the deeper we look, the more complexity we find, the more interrelationship we find. Understanding these complex processes indicates that we're not just tinkering with end of the pipe solutions, but we have to go right up to the start of the pipe and sort out the problem there. And once you do that, you unearth these deep social inequities, these deep governance problems, these deep inequitable distribution of resources, and gender is part of that package. And so in many ways, my feeling, you know, my day job, I'm a local government practitioner, so I deal with this stuff right at the coalface, is that, you know, we're dealing with enormous challenges, and we've got to give real-time insights into what needs to happen. You can't tinker around the edges anymore. These interventions need to be deep, and they need to allow us to really look at power relation and politics if we're going to make a change. So gender is just part of that. This is just a bigger developmental issue. You know, sometimes I worry about using the term climate change, because that really doesn't talk to the problem we're facing. I think that allows us to peripheralize and, you know, put it off somewhere in a corner and keep it nice and tidy out of people's way. When it's messy, it's in everyone's face. And it's really more about development and how we pursue that. I think if we solve the development challenge, we will, by definition, solve the climate change challenge. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks very much, Debra. And maybe to echo some of your thoughts too about how dynamic these conversations are. We're gathered here under the theme, of course, with food production and adaptation, but really it's impossible or irrelevant to limit the conversation really to just sectoral interests like that, like you've just said, Debra, and many of the other panelists also are bringing in so many other areas, and this is really necessary. I will give the panelists one more take-home message just as we conclude this webinar today. But just before that, I'll share some remarks. I wanted to echo the compelling remark made by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Many poor people are getting clobbered by climate change. I've not heard language such as that before, but that's really highlighting just the amount of injustice there. And last week's IPCC report informs us that putting adaptation and adaptation financing on equal footing with mitigation can help us, our food systems, and our living world out of the current danger zone. With this in mind, I hand the floor again to the panelists to share a brief take-home message with us from today's talks and discussion on adapting food production. I'll leave the last word with you, Debra, so maybe I will start with Jennie.
Well, thanks so much. We've been talking about developing context today, and of course, climate adaptation needs are not just limited to those systems, but they're very much a reality here in our systems as well, if we're going to secure global food systems. But I just wanted to pay attention to this, that the toolbox is already in use, and there are limits to some of the tools, both technical and perhaps even social and others, and that farmers and landowners are the main custodians of the land, and therefore they are the solutions in many places, even if we academics want to provide some ideas about that. And the second point I want to make is, for my fellow researchers and especially the young able generation coming up, that think about what the working group is not telling. Where are the evidence and the confidence is high, and maybe think about what is it not telling and what do we need to know to go forward in the coming years to make sure that we get that adaptation into place. And I really look forward, an exciting time forward, that we will have this new and innovative research contributions coming through to support the adaptation plan forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. Stephen, your take-home messages.
Thank you very much, Paul. And my message, I want to re-emphasize, and I know that in the discussion today, the issue of development has come in, just like Jenny have mentioned, that when you look at the whole issue of drought, it doesn't need to add up as an emergency. If we really focus on adaptation in a whole basket way, like Debra has explained, from the beginning of the pipe, and especially including the local people, the ones who are feeling the pinch of that drought, then we can start to have some gain. Otherwise, responding to emergencies, it doesn't really work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And Harry.
Yes, I think I would conclude based on our discussion today that technical solutions are not enough, that vulnerability is not a function of exposure to climate events, that it's deeply embedded in our society and our institutional structures, and that one of the most important things that we need to do to address vulnerability and to support long-term effective adaptation is to invest in more democratic local governance structures with resources and meaningful discretion over planning processes and explicit protection for marginal groups.
Thanks so much for those clear and concise messages, Harry. And I leave the last word then to Debra.
So given that I'm talking to researchers, very practically, where does one go from here? There's no doubt that the IPCC provides influential inputs into policy debates. The next big opportunity for a group like this would be the 7th assessment cycle. The first special report to come out of that assessment cycle will be a special report on cities. And what most concerns me about our discussions around issues related to food systems, food security, etc., is we're often urban blind, and often we're producing food to drive the world's cities. And I would say, linking to Jenny's blind spots, that would be an important sector that this community should rally around, is how do we manage rural areas as a continuum with urban to ensure that food security, given that the bulk of us are living and will continue to live in cities. So a real challenge to this community to fill that gap and to look to be involved in that special report when the call for authorship is put out, because I do worry that we are going to get one of those blind spots when we talk about cities in relationship to food. We pointed to the need for example, urban agriculture in our report, but again, we need to do those deep dives. So a real challenge to mobilize this community for that upcoming special report, because the special reports, no doubt, are easier for policymakers to use. They're on a single topic, they're much shorter, they're not 3,700 pages long. And they give you more bang for your buck. So a bit of advertisement for that special report. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Debra. And I wish now to close the webinar today. So on behalf of SLU Global and SLU Future Food, the hosts of today's seminar, together with the 4 future platforms at SLU, we extend our thanks again to each of the speakers and to you, the audience, especially for your good questions, and for joining this webinar as part of the Climate Conversation series. And we look forward to your participation in future events in this series throughout this year. So keep an eye on the webpage for future forthcoming events. Thank you so much, everybody, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the day. Thank you.